And now to our main program, Father Steve Sundborg. Did you know that a select few of the best speakers at this podium have been Rotarians? Father Steve is one of these. When I thought about the challenges and opportunities in the world today around human interaction and who would be a great speaker on this topic, my first choice was Father Steve. I am delighted that he said yes and have been eagerly looking forward to his talk today. In his 22nd year as president of Seattle University, Father Steve has also been a 22-year member of Seattle 4. On May 23rd, Father Steve was celebrated as the 81st recipient of the prestigious Seattle King County First Citizen Award. He was praised as a selfless leader who shows up and has deep commitment to community building. Please give Father Steve your warmest welcome.
I told Kim I've been to Unalakleet. I grew up in the territory of Alaska. I've been out there. I've been asked in this inaugural talk of this new year of Rotary 4, under the leadership of President Kim Moore, to introduce us into an emphasis this year on civic engagement and on civil discourse. In a year in which the wind-up to the presidential election is already here and the local council races are heating up, this subject of the year of civil discourse is especially pertinent. I decided to frame the year with a talk that I gave a title to of Civility, Reclaiming the Idea of America. Perhaps for no talk that I have given have I so enjoyed and found the preparation so enriching and enlightening through the width and the depth of my reading and conversation and thought as it has been for this talk. It's been helpful for me personally, and so I thank Kim for the invitation. And I hope it will be helpful for all of us, not just for today, but for the whole year. My subject is America. Let me start by saying to you what I often say to others. Every once in a while, it's good to leave Seattle and visit America. You don't have to go far. Spokane, Walla Walla, Yakima, Tri-Cities, Ellensburg will do. Seattle is to America something like what the moon is to the earth. Perhaps Seattleite is a misspelling of satellite. Seattle orbits America. So what is America? I love the statement of a famous political scientist of the last century. To be an American is an ideal. To be a Frenchman is a fact. To be an American is an ideal. To be a Frenchman is a fact. Our country is constituted not because we live in the same space or have a common ancestry among us. Rather, it's constituted by an ideal. We are who we are as Americans because of our striving, our struggling, fighting, disagreeing with one another in pursuit of an idea. The realization of that idea has not yet been attained in its fulfillment. This makes us a unique nation. It's our glory, our strength, but it's also very precarious as a nation because that idea must be known, must be retold, must be renewed, and what has been left out of the idea must now become a part of it. You know, we're a curious people in the history of other countries. Other countries are nation states. We are a state nation. Others had a common language or ancestry or place, and only then became a state. We had no common language, no common ancestry, no place, but we came here. We formed a state, or more likely a federation of states, And then only gradually, over about 50 years after our Declaration of Independence, did we begin to seek and to have a national identity to become a nation. So part of my thesis is today that we have a fractured identity as a nation, and hence our hostility and our incivility, because the very idea of America is fractured, not commonly held, or it badly needs to be updated, especially in incorporating those whom the idea claims to include in the story of America, but who have not been included. We are less constituted by the whole of the Constitution of the United States of America than just by its first three words, we the people. The idea of America is that we are a people who belong to one another, that we depend on one another, that we know one another, that we pull for one another, even that we love one another. The idea of America is a relationship among us, a kinship, a connected people agreeing on our equality as persons and citizens under the law, and agreeing to equally share in the governing of ourselves, but able to disagree about all of the issues within these fundamental agreements. The idea of America is we the people. The idea is fractured when some of the people have been or still are left out of the we. For instance, slaves, blacks, women, gays, indigenous peoples, new immigrants, especially swarthy or of color, anyone considered other than ourselves, those on the right, those on the left. Does this very simple but powerful idea which constitutes America, does it hold today? The idea of simply that America is a we, not an us and a them. So where did we get our idea of America? The one that needs to be reclaimed today, the one that calls for civil discourse in conversation and inclusive citizenship. I got it myself when I was 10 years old on a rainy day in the territory of Alaska in Juneau, when listless, I turned to my father and I said, "Dad, would you have a book in your den that I might enjoy reading?" And he went into his den and he came back and he handed me Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. And I walked back upstairs and I put on my pajamas and I started reading. And soon enough, I was on the Mississippi with Tom and Becky and Huck, and I've never stopped reading. There for me was the beginning of the idea of America. I followed it up with The Red Badge of Courage, The Last of the Mohicans, My Friend Flicka, Paul Bunyan, anything about Abe Lincoln, and later on, books like Uncle Tom's Cabin and Grapes of Wrath, and so forth. Here was the idea of America taking shape in me, and this was how it was formed, through reading. Students today, and maybe you, get the idea more from movies than from books. So how did the idea of America, we the people, which holds us together, that we struggle and fight for, and that we fight with one another about, how did it take shape in you? The idea of America is a great one, an attractive one, an inspiring one, an idea that gave us the glue of our people, our belonging to one another. Was the history we imbibed or studied the true history of we the people? Does the idea of America formed in us like our DNA as Americans still work? Not very well, because it left out blacks and women as equal, and persons of other gender identities and expressions, and Native peoples with their own legitimate nations, and important immigrant groups, and persons excluded, such as the Chinese, when 9 out of the 10 of the people who built the Transcontinental Railroad were Chinese, and any we still consider not real Americans. Here is where the fracture of the idea of America occurs, and the fracture of our national identity, and hence our hostility and incivility. The issue of America is fundamentally, do we belong to one another? Do all of us belong to one another? The idea of we the people is still there, and we're fighting over who belongs, but we're in a period of intense pressure and friction and heat because of the challenge to include all of the people in we the people. Our history is a glorious one and a shameful one. We need to know our true history and write its constitution with an updated story of the new people we now are. Benjamin Franklin loved to say, "Lie stands on one foot, truth stands on two." Our history, as most of us learned it and loved it, stood on one foot and was essentially a myth, a lie. We have the chance, if we will take it, to stand on truth, if we will stand on the 2 feet of our true history and the truth of who all of us are today, who belong to one another. I like to think of this as going to what I consider the most sacred place in America. For me, that's to walk down from the mall, on the mall into the capital of Washington, D.C., past the National Galleries and the archives and the Smithsonian and the Washington Monument and the war memorials, and up the steps to the Lincoln Memorial to look up at Abe, seated peacefully and gazing out over America. This is the most sacred place in America because this is where its idea is in the person of Abe himself, flanked by the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural, which expressed the idea of oneness and equality of all people. No place as much as that place is the heart, the altar of America. There I can pray for America. But it's not complete, for I must now turn around and step back out of the sanctuary and look for the circle in the marble platform where Martin Luther King stood. He too looked like Abe over a vast crowd of America around the reflecting pool on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he proclaimed a dream of the fulfillment of the idea of America, one people belonging to one another, with the full inclusion of the African American people who were not yet, in truth, emancipated. His dream was the evoking of a true history of the idea of America, not just for blacks, but for all oppressed and excluded and unfree and not included or not invited and not belonging. Perhaps what really makes this the most sacred place in America is not only Abe seated so peacefully with his arms resting upon that chair, or Martin Luther King sweating in the sun, but the third part of the scene is the people themselves around that reflecting pool, reflecting the hopes and the commitment to belong to one another as equal, free, and together governing the nation. It's this idea of America, then, that I want to talk about, and what's the role of civility in reclaiming it? Civility can be seen as a matter of good manners, etiquette, politeness. These are important. George Washington wrote down 100 rules of civility, but they were a school exercise based on, God bless them, the 100 rules of civility composed by who else but the Jesuits in France. Those Jesuits just keep showing up. All 100 of these rules of civility are essentially about good manners. James Madison got closer to the deeper importance of civility in his own 5 rules of civility, such as focus on the idea of the person rather than on the person, and push the state to the highest version of itself. I like the definition of civility as, quote, claiming and caring for one's identity, needs, and beliefs without degrading someone else's in the process. Caring for one's identity, needs, and beliefs without degrading someone else's in the process. I would propose more simply that we define civility as the conversation of citizens, the conversation of citizens. That's what's needed, what we have a responsibility to one another for because of our belonging to one another. We sometimes hear the phrase, speaking truth to power. Civility is speaking truth to one another. Civility does not mean agreement. Rather, civility as equal citizens means agreeing on how we deal with our disagreements, rather than agreeing about the issues. The example of Al Gore and George W. Bush strongly disagreeing with one another about the decision of the Supreme Court on the winner of their contested election is telltale. Gore said, quote, "Now it is ended resolved, as it must be resolved through the honored institutions of our democracy," end quote. Bush was just as gracious and principled in replying, quote, "Americans share hopes and goals and values far more important than political disagreements. Republicans want the best for the nation. Democrats want the same. Our votes may differ, but not our hopes," end quote. Now that's true civility, the conversation of citizens who disagree on issues but agree on how those disagreements are resolved. There's a challenge to civility among us which is essentially caused by our not being able and not even wanting to know one another. A University of Michigan study showed that college students today score 40% lower than those in the 1970s in their ability to understand what another person is feeling, and the biggest drop has occurred in the years since 2000. This is a drop in empathy, being able to enter into the experience and feelings of another in order to appreciate how they see the world, in our case, how they see the nation. What we need as citizens is conversation, not unbudging debate when we are with one another, or denigration of one another when we are apart. These attitudes are so grooved in our ideologies that we cannot listen to and appreciate the experience of others. Civility is not politeness, it's the empathetic conversation of citizens. Citizens who care for one another and want to know one another's experience with no one being left out of the conversation. Civility does not mean we don't fight. Married people fight, I'm told. Our nation has been shaped by its citizens fighting with one another, but it must be a disagreeing and a fighting with one another, but it must be a disagreeing and a fighting within the belonging to one another as we the people. The great author Jill Lepore, the author of the best and most recent, the truest and the fullest history of the United States of America, with all that makes part of it, says in her little book that followed it, This America, the Case for the Nation, the following: Americans are bound by our past, but even more powerfully, we are bound to one another. This America is a community of belonging and commitment, held together by the strength of our ideas and by the force of our disagreements. The nation, however, is the fight, and she italicized is. The nation, as ever, is the fight. Civility is this agreement and disagreement of citizens in conversation, speaking two-footed truth to one another, even fighting while disagreeing, and finding out how we resolve those disagreements in a democracy. It's because we believe the idea of America is worth it that the nation is the fight, not the freedom, not free from the fight. A false civility is one that appeals to propriety in order to veil or suppress listening to the voices of others with empathy, not seeking to feel and to understand them, taking the side of another, but rather putting them in their place. As some have noted, we have models of civility in persons who have died recently: John McCain, George H.W. Bush, Paul Allen, Charles Krauthammer, Billy Graham. I learned of civility from a great public servant and model of civility, Dan Evans, who said things have always been partisan because there are two parties. But the difference is that in his day, they expressed differences over issues, whereas now it is over persons and personalities. Did you read, as I did, a recent poll of our state and of Oregon that showed that 40% said it is not important for them to make new friends, and 49% said they don't even want to talk briefly or to interact with people they don't know. No civics lesson or course, no study of the checks and balances of our country will change that. It's an issue of belonging, of care, of empathy, of who belongs in the we of America. Maybe there's a reason why the French Jesuits wrote those 100 rules of civility, which George Washington dutifully copied down. Because there's a fundamental rule of the Jesuits, though we too fail, and by the way, like married people, we too fight. And it's always to put the best interpretation on the statement of another, giving them multiple opportunities to explain it. And after presupposing their goodwill, only then, if we see that the statement cannot be defended, that we counteract it. A good example of this is a president of St. Louis University, Fred Pistello. What he said about gauging the disruptions on his campus after Ferguson. Quote, "At the outset, we simply talked and listened to one another. We worked to find areas of understanding and agreement and not dwell on our differences. Throughout those discussions, we in positions of leadership strove to speak using the poetry of compassion, respect, and dignity rather than the prose of fear, power, and threat. The poetry of compassion and respect and dignity rather than the prose of fear and power and threat. That's civility. That's speaking to one another and listening to one another's truth. It's the kind of civility of citizens in conversation that alone has the chance of reclaiming the idea of America itself that must hold the nation together. We need this civility because America is not a fact. It's an ideal which alone binds it together as a nation. What I've said so far about the idea of America and how civility can reclaim it relates closely to our Rotarian four-way test. Is it the truth? Asks, is the idea of America that we belong to one another our truth and that we need to speak the truth to one another? Is it fair to all concerned? Asks, who has been left out of the history of we the people and who have we not included today in our common care? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Gives us the hope that the realization of the idea of America will restore goodwill in the land and bring enrichment of having friendships with those from whom we are currently separated. And 4, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Is itself a statement of the idea of America reclaimed by truth-telling conversation among citizens. Nothing could better foster our four-way test and nothing more pertinent than for it to be proposed this year as a focus on civic engagement and civil discourse. May the year be for us a series of conversations as citizens who speak and relate with civility because we belong to one another as Rotarians and as Americans. And a very good way to enter into that conversation would be for all of us to participate actively in the 2-hour program which will replace our meeting that day in Town Hall on August 21st, when Jeff Robinson, who is among us today, will give a talk called Who We Are, a Chronicle of Racism in America. And if I were able to add one more test to our 4-way test or make it a 5-way test for what we deal with this year, it would be, is it done with humility? Civility requires humility. So I place before you this challenge of reclaiming the idea of America through civility as what we can keep in order to move forward together as a nation as we so badly need to do. It reminds me that if an elephant sways all over the place and veers and doesn't keep on the track, if you take an iron ball and place it in its trunk, it will no longer veer but will walk straight forward. I'm proposing that the simplest and truest idea of America, we the people, a people belonging to one another, is the iron ball which can move us straight ahead as we so clearly need to do. I end with perhaps the first expression of the idea of America. In 1630, in Salem Harbor, before landing in America, John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, said to his fellow Puritans still aboard the ship, quote, "We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our community as members of the same body. There's the germ of the idea of America before we were a state or a federation of states or a nation. It's still alive, still being fought for. It's worth being fought for, being reclaimed, being retold by all of us of this nation in the civility, which is the conversation of citizens that we owe one another. Thank you very much.